I'm Robert Fishman. I'm the head of the Division of Conservatorship in FHFA, and I've been living the CSP and the single security for 7 years now. Feels like dog years, 50 years, yes. Anyway, I want to introduce the panel members. So Renee Schultz, Senior Vice President at Fannie Mae, and Mark Hansen, Senior Vice President at Freddie Mac. If you don't know who they are and you work in the MBS world, something's wrong. So they've both been around for quite a while and are key to this endeavor. This panel is to talk about alignment. Just to give a little history, FHFA has been working on alignment of the enterprises for many years now. There's been quite a number of things that we've done, even before we focused on the single security. So many of you may be familiar with things where things like, and these are particularly the post-crisis world, the credit box, standards for servicers, eligibility standards, financial standards, reps and warranties, servicing standards when loans are delinquent, quite a number of things to get the enterprises aligned across the board. Of course, over the last several years, we've been particularly focused on getting alignment on those activities that affect cash flows to investors to support the UMBS, the single security. That have been things such as when delinquent loans are bought out of pools and types of programs, streamline refi, et cetera, that directly affect cash flows to investors. We had done all this work in our role as conservator, often through issuing directives or other instructions to the enterprises. One of the main types of feedback that FHFA has received over the years is that's all well and good. What can you do, however, to make sure that it's durable, that it could last for a longer period of time? And what we decided to do in several panels previously, Craig and others mentioned, we decided to issue a regulation to embed within a regulation some of these same provisions. So back in the fall, we issued a proposed rule, which basically had at its heart the requirement that the enterprises align on key policies, programs, processes that affect the cash flows to investors. We included in this proposed rules both some qualitative standards and some quantitative standards. It was out there for comment. We received some excellent, very thoughtful comments. And as mentioned, just last week, we issued the final rule. Just to go through the major provisions of the rule. One, we are requiring that the enterprises align on key policies, procedures that affect the cash flows to investors, and we have a whole definition section in the rule, and it defines it rather broadly. Second, we require that the enterprises monitor and then report to us if there ever is any misalignment. And we actually, I guess thirdly, define what misalignment means, both for very large cohorts and then also for what are known as the cheapest to deliver quartile, where we set up some quantitative standards. We also require the enterprises to ensure they have processes within their institutions to identify, evaluate, escalate, and submit to FHFA when they are proposing to change a policy, a practice that could have a material effect on the cash flows to investors. We also lay out in the regulation what are some remedies that FHFA as regulator could take, if appropriate, should there be a material misalignment. This includes things like telling an enterprise to stop a program, to start a program, to change a program. We also note in the preamble, as with all of our regulations, that the FHFA has the authority to impose civil monetary penalties if an enterprise were to violate a regulation. It's very similar to all of our other regulations. In the preamble to the final rule that was issued last week, we also mentioned a few other policies that we've newly put in place. This deals with the concern that has been out there about the individual loan note rates that are going to individual MBS. And we put out there some specific new criteria, 112.5 basis point cap on the maximum difference between a loan note rate and an MBS, and a 50 basis points cap on servicing. The goal of those restrictions are to further make consistent the loans that go into individual MBS coupons. That will allow there to be greater consistency in prepayments, both within individual bonds and across the enterprises. So it's been quite an effort over multiple years. The proof is in the pudding, as always, For those who monitor, and I'm sure many of you do here, the prepayments, very, very aligned between the institutions, and they have been for years. And it's something that we're closely monitoring and believe that the regulation we put in place, along with our other activities, will help ensure remains aligned over time, because we realize that that's an important component to the success of the UMBS. I'm going to actually turn first to Renee and then Mark to talk a little bit about what they're doing within their own shops and their own perspectives on alignment as part of UMBS. Renee?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Robert. So I think one of the things that really struck me early on when we kicked off the Single Security Initiative is the work that we started to do in 2014 when the two enterprises started to work together on the disclosures. And while we have very similar disclosures, there were some nuances like maybe rounding versus truncating or what have you. But when we started to really get into the pooling rules, it became very clear to me that we are more aligned than we're different. And it was very surprising to me. I mean, we both have, 1,200-page selling guides, so you'd think there'd be a lot of differences between that. But when we started to put together the spreadsheet of comparing and contrasting, we largely were aligned on many of the items. And where there were differences, we worked collectively together to figure out which might be the best outcome. And so that was just back in 2014. I mean, Robert, you touched on the fact that ever since conservatorship, we actually have been working jointly on a number of initiatives on alignment that were well before the Single Security Initiative was even contemplated. And we continue to do so. I mean, we both have scorecards that you publish for us external, and a lot of that work is joint work between the two enterprises where we can further alignment where it makes sense to do so. And so I know it's hard for folks to think that there is that much alignment because you're like, well, there is some noise in terms of speeds and what have you. And some of that is the profile of who the cellular servicers are between the two enterprises. And so it's our job to make sure that we're managing that appropriately. So when we do see an outlier, having conversations with lenders, explaining to them why it's important to be part of your performance in line with cohort. And there's outcomes that can happen that aren't too favorable to a seller servicer, a Fannie Mae, if they don't get in alignment. And so we've had a number of difficult conversations. And one of the most kind of the biggest stick that we have is we could just say, we're going to terminate our relationship because you're actually hurting our reputation of that security. And so we haven't had to go to that quite of an extreme, but the message gets very clear when you're starting to have those kind of candid discussions. And so again, what I would like to just kind of leave you with is that I was very surprised back in 2014 on how much alignment there really was by the enterprises. We continue to do that work. And Robert, as you mentioned, and I just want to reiterate, is when we do have a new program or we're changing eligibility, we have a very robust process within Fannie Mae to ensure that prepayment speeds are not going to be impacted by that. And part of, our oversight by FHFA is that we have to submit for approval on changes to eligibility for programs. And part of the documentation, if you will, is a little box that says, do you believe this is going to have an impact on security performance? And so if we check it yes, there's going to be a lot more conversations between both FHFA, the enterprise, and the other enterprise. So far that hasn't been the case, but we are operating as if we're under the single security regime already, and so again, helping to drive that alignment.
Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, Renee's laid a lot out here that we agree with. When we started all this, we thought of prepayments in 3 different levels. For those that care, on 4th business night, after about 6 o'clock, a lot of you race to see who can get the prepayment speeds out the fastest. And what the first number that comes out is the aggregate prepayment speed. And that doesn't tell you much. It's interesting in that moment, but it really doesn't tell you that much. The second level is more important to us, and that's at the cohort level. Because at the cohort level, that's where all the prepayment models start to derive their information. What we felt was most important in all this was to make sure that if at the end of the day we're trying to support one market, we had to have one prepayment model that supported it. You can't have differences and expect valuations to come out in the same place. So our focus initially was to make sure that our cohorts lined up. And back in those early days, we really just looked at 2 qualities. It was the term and the coupon. as we fast forward to where the final rule came out, there's a third dimension, which is going to be origination year, which adds even more precision to what that looks like. But our original goal was to make sure that even if we bought the same loans, we could still have cohorts that misaligned if we slotted those loans into different coupons. So our focus was mostly at the cohort level. The third level that we thought about, but we weren't really sure what to do with initially, also came out in the final rule, which is what does cheapest to deliver look like? Because that's really where TBA is priced. That's really where the borrower's mortgage rate comes from in all of this. So our starting point again was cohort, then we looked at cheapest to deliver. At a cohort level, what was so important to us was to make sure that once we got the loans relatively representative of the industry, and by that, Fannie and Freddie are the conforming industry. We wanted to make sure we lined up our seller servicers in proportion. We wanted to make sure that the way that we pooled was in proportion. The next step was to make sure nothing about our policies, programs, procedures, terms of businesses, all the things that are mentioned in the rule were out of line. And as you've seen over the last several years, our speeds are very close at a cohort level. Now as we start to turn to the final rule, it's going to get a little tougher. I think, back then we maybe had 17 or 18 targets, if you will. And those targets were the cohorts of a certain size. Well, when we add 7 years of origination or issuance to that, now we've got 80 plus targets, 87, 90 targets, I think is what we counted the other day. And not only are those targets greater in number, they'll also be smaller in size when we start thinking about the worst quartile in each of those targets. So I think we've done a great job of lining up our cohort level at the coupon and term. Now we're going to go one step further with this rule to make an even more predictable market with less uncertainty around these cheapest to deliver cohorts and to stay within the boundaries. I think, if you haven't read the rule, what you'll see is there's a tolerance. I think it's 2 and 3 CPR at the larger cohort, 5 and 8 at the smaller. We did some back testing. We went back 7 years and looked at it. And in ballpark, about 4 cohorts a month will fall outside of the 3 CPR range between the two of us. And so each of those will require some kind of investigation and understanding as to what the drivers are. If they get further out, then we have to put forward a remediation activity behind all that. So, I guess what I'm trying to get to is what we started with was, as Renee laid out, we started looking at the guides and where we were like, where we weren't. We moved on to cohorts. Now there's a whole different level of administration, management, trade-off within each of the enterprises that I think is going to make an even better TBA market than what you've all enjoyed thus far. It'll be more predictable with greater scale, and you'll have, not just the 3 entities here, but all of those in the industry that are kind of counting and targeting in that tolerance, that tighter tolerance than we've ever had for our performance to land.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks both Ray and Mark. So, key point we want to make is we have had a lot of activity over the last several years on alignment. We are getting it more and more focused on the cash flows to investors, kind of as Mark was laying out. And we're very confident that we'll be able to maintain this going forward. It's a pretty exciting time as we move forward to the UMBS, and it was a very big accomplishment to get the rule done last week, and we think it was impetus to further things in the industry. So I don't know if there are any other comments on alignment or generally.
I just think, and I think Dave Benson mentioned it well up front. At the end of the day, it's on us to make a similar product. And if that product is similar, then we've developed and evolved, probably one of the greatest, most liquid markets to an even better stage. So it's our mutual objective in all this to get there.
Yeah.
We have the same motivations.
Yes, we do. We do.
Oh, and the monetary penalties get us there too.
Yeah.
It doesn't pay off.
And so we don't go there. Yes. Okay. Questions or no questions?
I'm okay.
Okay, we can do questions.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions, if folks have questions. I see someone right there.
Yeah, this is actually an alignment question, but you guys have all been around, you're all very experienced, you've all been around a long time, and what lessons have you learned from the Ready Gold rollout in the early 90s that you applied to UMBS?
So I wasn't there then, so I'm not quite that bad. Mark was there, so I might look to Mark.
I came just after, just
Yeah.
for the record. But yeah, let me repeat the question for the benefit of the videotape. It's kind of a look back, lessons learned. What did we learn from 1990 when Freddie Mac tried to change its payment delay and start a new market? And I would say at least 2 or 3 important ones that we've corrected for in this exercise. The first is liquidity is magical. When you lose it, it's hard to get back. And so, you know, what Freddie tried to do back then was stop a 75-day delay market and start a 45-day delay market. And although it might have been well conceived, the implementation lasted maybe 2 or 3 years from the start date forward. It was very difficult to start with 0 float and get market makers to be very confident offering out bonds for the roll market to develop. My rough recollection was we couldn't even get REMIX done in the first 6 months. And we only had 1 or 2 dealers that were willing to commit capital to that market. So that was probably the most important lesson learned in all this. You know, there's no doubt Fannie is the bigger, more liquid market at this point. And so our first thought was, then why mess with that, right? Let's keep Fannie in place. They have great liquidity. The dollar rolls are vibrant. The trading activity is robust. Let's not mess with that. Let's treat this more as Fannie staying in its lane and Freddie merging in to the extent that it can. And I think, again, that echoes one of the earlier thoughts, which is let's take the Fannie liquidity as a minimum and grow it from there. So first was don't mess with liquidity if you don't have to. I think the second was let everybody know it's coming. You know, as I understood, again, I was, I think, on the buy side coming to Freddie at that time. I didn't know what the gold program was till I landed at Freddie. And I should have known that coming from the, it was a big insurance company at the time. Well, this market outreach effort is a reaction to that lesson learned, to Lori's question, which is, it's fine if you're okay, but you're not the market. You have to get the entirety of the market, not just the capital providers, but those that provide services, the vendors, pricing services, netting and clearing. We took all of that to great priority in this, which is to make sure that the critical players knew about this well in advance of their readiness requirements. So hopefully, whether it's this conference or the last 4 or 5 years of materials and animations and webinars and one-on-ones, that we have sufficiently moved the needle in terms of market readiness so that you see this coming.
Yeah, I think, Mark, you covered it exactly right. And, you know, when we first kicked off the initiative, our #1 premise was we didn't want to disrupt the TBA market. And so we used that as our guiding principle. And I think the other thing, too, is obviously we've been waiting for the common securitization platform to be built, so that's taken some time. But also, I feel that we have been very thoughtful about our approach, and it has taken a number of years, despite the platform, just to make sure that we're getting this right, and also to make sure that the industry is prepared. The last thing we want to do is go live and people are like, oh my gosh, I don't have screens, I don't know where the market is, what have you. And so the industry readiness has been a huge undertaking, especially over the last 18 months, I would say. And you know, we wanted to have feedback from the industry, and that's why we had the advisory group and met quarterly to make sure that we were thinking through everything that needed to be thought of to make sure that we have a successful launch come June.
Maybe time for another question?
Yeah, one in the middle.
There's one there.
This question maybe is a little bit technical. It's related to the 2 rules for the WAC spreads the FHFA just released. One of it is obviously it's need to be above 112.5 bips. The other is a maximum service fee of 50 bip. I'm just wondering how this maximum service of 50 bip apply to cash window loans. Let's say if a cash window servicer sell a loan to the GSEs and at a 4.5% mortgage rate, and you guys decide to slot it into 3.5 coupon. Now within this 100 bip WAC spread, how much is considered to be the servicing and how much is considered to be G fee? Because I'm not sure the originator or the service of cash window loans decide what is the servicing fee here.
Sure. So I'll start. You can jump in. So we put in 2 requirements in the rule. 112.5 maximum between the note rate and the MBS rate, and then 50 basis points max servicing. That 50 basis points includes the standard 25 servicing fee. So let's use your example. So the borrower gets a 4.5% mortgage loan, and it's going to be put into a 3.5% MBS. That's 100 basis points. So just stopping right there, it clearly meets the 112, right? Because it's 100. It's within the 112. Typically, just to use rounder numbers than exact, let's say that the G fee was 45 and the standard servicing was 25. That's pretty standard out there, right? So those, I'm going to make sure I do the math quick, that's 70, all right? So now there's 30 more basis points that can be used either as a piece of it, excess servicing, up to 25 of that 30. They don't have to use that, or through buy-ups and buy-downs that go back to the lender. So that would be a choice of the lender working with Freddie or Fannie, who they're selling it to, for how they would do that extra 30 basis points. But at most, assuming 25 standard servicing, at most 25 of that 30 could be servicing. The other 5 would have to come from the IO strip, basically.
Well, one thing I would add is if you're selling a loan, when the lender goes to sell the loan to our whole loan conduit, they actually declare their servicing fee at that point in time. And we, in terms of the 50 basis points max servicing, are not distinguishing between MBS or whole loan. Because when you think about the GSE as the issuer, we're held to the same standards that the lender is in terms of issuing our security. So the max that a lender will be able to sell through the whole loan conduit when they declare their servicing is going to be 50 basis points is the max. That'll be decided at the moment they go to sell it. So whatever is left of the pass-through is what we will then do as a best execution to put it into whichever coupon is determined to be the best X. And so, so hopefully that kind of clarifies that it's not Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac that determines the servicing fee. It's actually the lender at the time that they go to sell through the conduit.
And I'll add to that as well, which is 112.5 is the max note rate at a loan level. We've done a little back testing, and when you put that together into a pool, the pool, because of all these buy-ups and buy-downs and slotting into the nearest half coupon, the pools end up closer to like the low to mid 80s in terms of the absolute WAC. So I think a lot of the reaction of late, and at least in 2019, has been pool WACs that exceed 100. We think that again, the note rate at 112.5 will create pool note rates, or pool WACs, if you will, that are probably closer to the mid 80s.
So to that point, Mark, I think it's really important is that prior to this change, if you looked at a lender's best execution, depending on the note rate, they might have had 4 or 5 different options. Now, with the tightening of this, the WAC at 112.5, it actually limits them to about 2 options. And so it really does tighten up, the variability of what is going into these securities and just how high those WACs are going to look.
Okay, with that, thank you. We're up for our next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.